if we could magically account for the circular economy in a way that includes all of the social values and the environmental values as well as material cost, then I think we have a shot at moving forward.
Into a new SI unit of
the new SI unit of circularity, absolutely.
Yeah. A Boyd. I think we should call it a Boyd. Hello, and welcome to Be Sustainable, where we turn complex ideas about sustainability into real-world solutions for the built environment. In today's episode, second of a series, we'll be talking about the circular economy. With me again, I have Dr. Pippa Boyd and Dr. Ankit Singh. Pippa is a senior lecturer at UCEM and is heavily involved in developing and delivering our MSc in Innovation in Sustainable Built Environments. Her experience straddles academia and industry with a background in mechanical engineering, production methods and change management. Her PhD explored the uptake of sustainable innovation in the built environment, and her research is particularly focused on construction technology. Dr. Ankit Singh is Director of Sustainability at Waterman Building Services Limited, part of the Waterman Group. Ankit leads the charge in implementing strategic sustainability initiatives in the construction sector. He collaborates closely with asset funders, developers and contractors to foster sustainable development across various projects and sectors. His academic background includes a PhD in making sense of strategy development for sustainability in large construction firms in the UK. He also has further qualifications from the University of Cambridge and MIT. Pippa, Ankit, welcome again. We talked last time the three of us met around the concepts of the circular economy. What was it about and what was its relevance to the built environment? What I'd like to talk about today is some of the implementation of that. How can we bring that to life? So my first question, Ankit, what would be the ideal framework for managing a circular economy within the built environment?
I think that's a very difficult question because it is multifaceted. It's not just in the control of the asset owner. It's also in interest of the planning authority and the rest to actually govern it. And then you've got the user that actually has to use it in the right and appropriate manner. So there are multiple stakeholders in that circular economy. We've made attempts for it. The GLA have required you to do a circular economy statement now for a few years. They've made it more robust through the way it's measured and reported, with local authorities now looking for an as designed and an as built. Now, the question where I kind of struggle with is, so what? What happens after that? Because once the building is operating, the metrics kind of change, because then it's all about the green premium that you might get from the building or the brown discount based off the fact that it has certain sustainability credentials. Now, the circular economy element feeds into that to a certain extent, but doesn't really stay alive past the as-built stage. And to me, that is a bit worrying. And that's where we've kind of focused on looking at monitoring material value through the material passports and the rest. But as an overarching framework, there is still one big key element missing, and that is the second-hand market. The second-hand users who are happy to say, that floorboard's all right, it's only been used for 15 years, we'll use it in our building. Insurance providers also need to come on board and say, right, we'll warrant that building for X amount of years. So at the moment, in the grand scheme of things, we're still a long way off from having that utopian framework that supports the circular economy.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, I think I would say that you're right. It's not one single framework. It's lots of different ways of doing things. And a lot of the focus now is on the design and the construction of the building, actually how we operate it and use it. And as Ankit says, take the value from that is interesting, which sort of leads you on to this idea that actually components of the building can almost be supplied as a service. You know, you now have the idea of components as a service, internal fit out as a service, lighting as a service, where companies own the assets. They are happy to come, install, strip out, reconfigure and resupply. So I think that's quite an interesting, whether it's a framework or a business model, I'm not entirely sure. It's a little bit of both, because within that comes this, not only the idea of, who's going to insure it, but who's responsible for transportation, for damage, for all sorts of other things.
So in a future model, I might rent you the lighting of your building and then service and maintain it and then update it at a future point.
Absolutely. And that means probably that I might standardize the housing for those components. I may be able to fit within that your different lux requirements or your different spectrum configurations, if you like. But I'm going to make sure that is a standard that's put into the buildings that I service.
And Philips have actually done that. They've got the rent-a-lux scheme, where essentially they own it, they operate the lighting fixtures. And from their point of view, it actually works better, because if you think as a lighting manufacturer, you're missing out on an opportunity to stay associated with the asset, number one, because normally what happens is once you've supplied it, once it's installed, you walk away from it. Whereas now you've got an opportunity to stay attached to that asset and then have revenue coming in for about 5 to 10 years, depending on the fit-out period. And it's a very valid point that Pippa makes, is fit-out components are actually the easiest to move to that model, purely because if you think about it, most office leases are not lasting more than 5 to 10 years. There's a routine change of internal fit-out. Therefore, those components should be sitting with the manufacturers, because it allows them to, maximize their value coming out of the asset. And then we always know that it's going to sit within that little circular spectrum.
And they're also best place to keep the material passport, if you like. So they know exactly how this has been used. They know exactly how long it's got left to run, and they can maintain control of that.
And potentially then that also transfers the responsibility for disposal or decommissioning to the manufacturer, at the same time providing an incentive to extend the lifespan of those components.
Yes.
So they're actually gaining a lot of value, because, like I said, staying associated with the asset gives you a steady revenue stream. And at the same time, from an asset owner point of view, the carbon also sits with the manufacturer, because it's effectively all they're doing is leasing that element.
Yeah.
So there is an opportunity there for the industry to adapt to a slightly different business model, which allows them a far greater flexibility. Because if you think of the way a lot of the office spaces are being developed, they're usually done to Cat A with shell and floor for that reason, because once the fit out happens, it's usually down to who the tenant is, what they require. Each tenant has a different requirement. It gives them massive flexibility where that's concerned. So for an asset owner, that is how it should be done, because essentially they don't carry the risk of those components either. That sits with the manufacturer.
Interestingly, it sort of feeds into productivity and the way that we do projects at the moment. Because at the moment, putting up the shell and core of a building is possibly not as time-consuming as doing the internal fit-out. Yeah. And so if we start to have businesses that are designing for taking away and disassembling and then reusing, perhaps we can get a degree of standardization that will speed that process up as well. So it becomes in everybody's interests.
Well, and that standardization presumably is key to this. That if I, as a building owner, want to change my lighting supplier, that there has to be some common element for a new lighting supplier to come in and fit their kit, rather than strip everything out and start from scratch.
Absolutely agree. And you've seen that, and that's where regulation comes in. And you've seen that being done with your Apple chargers from the EU, where they've standardized a component because for that very reason. And you will have to have regulation and someone bold enough to say to the built environment sector that you need to start standardizing these components that go into your building in terms of fit out, which allows them. And there are lots of advisory bodies out there that can guide that process with, the British Council of Offices and the rest that can actually do it and trial that system where you can start to standardize these components, so you know for a fact that you'll have multiple suppliers available to you at all times, which is a key portion of being able to maintain your asset and repair it, and it maximizes value, is that you're able to have that supply coming through as well.
Yeah, I'd very much like to come back to that point of regulation and who says that we have to do this. But before we do, I just, Pippa, in terms of the impact of this standardisation on the design of buildings, where would that take us, do you think?
I think it becomes a very interesting challenge. I think it's a question then of the ideas of the client and the architect being somewhat rejigged. So we no longer have a sort of a clean piece of paper that everybody sort of does something interesting on. But even if you get away from, how does the architect do the design? And we heard earlier in a previous episode that architects are starting to embrace that change. We talk then about manufacture, and actually the more standard we are, the more we can do off-site manufacture, the more that we can reap the benefits of a sort of a modularized manufacturing process where we can reduce the waste and make everything in a sense more standardized, but there's going to always be a way of trying to change it, trying to make it a little bit unique. I think that's in our nature. It has to be unique. And I think the point that sort of fits with that and fits within the previous point of, is everything going to have to be plug and play? That can also get in the way of innovation.
Yeah.
And if we paint ourselves into, we have to do it this way, actually, where's the room for the new player? Where's the room for the new idea?
Yeah. Otherwise, every room is the same size and every building is the same dimensions. Yes. And all of the artistry disappears from it. Yeah.
But also the innovation for more sustainability.
True. Yeah. Yeah.
You almost end up in the situation of governed innovation to a large extent, which, I'm borrowing from a different sector, but it has worked in Formula One. That's exactly what it is. They tell you what a standard base car should be.
Yeah.
And yet, by the time the season finishes, your car looks entirely different. And you say, but it's within the rules.
And the performance differentials have changed over time.
Exactly. So you can still innovate, but it's about understanding what elements you want to govern and how you govern it. And you say, right, these elements are standardized because we're cutting cost, which in this case would be we're doing it to cut carbon. Yeah. It's the same. So essentially, you can borrow and learn from different sectors and implement it in the most appropriate manner for this.
Well, the F1 is an interesting example because whatever you think of the green credentials of F1 as a sport, they have moved to a world where they have hybrid technology on the cars. They have moved to a world where they limit the number of combustion engines you can use in a season, and so on, with a penalty attached if you break that. And actually, reliability has improved because it has required an investment of time and effort in that. There have to be parallels there with the built environment, surely.
Absolutely, because you've optimized it to a level, like you're saying, you're using fewer components across a year. Your travel methods have changed. You are actually looking at maximizing performance, which is critical for the built environment, for the net zero challenge sitting there in the corner. You've got to maximize performance. And it's actually quite similar. They've used similar components. The internal combustion engine has been there for years, but the way it's been deployed, it's a much smaller combustion engine as well, which is actually delivering more power. So you're able to eke out building performance. And that's where we kind of move away from just being building services engineers or structural engineers or architects to building performance engineers, where you're trying to optimize the building for maximum output. You're trying to maximize the wellness credentials to increase productivity. All of those elements kind of come with it. And I think that's the change that we need, is to start thinking slightly differently about the governance that sits with it, is that it's not going to kill innovation. It could be used to channel it in the right way.
Which brings us neatly back to, thank you for this, because it brings us very neatly back to where I wanted to go anyway, which is back to the point you were making earlier on about regulation and who should regulate and what is regulatable within this space. So who are is this a national government requirement and feeds somewhere into zero carbon efforts, or is this a multinational, international, is it an EU?
Well, it's an interesting point, and this is something I've struggled with, with the concept of the signing up to net zero, because it's a challenge for us all. And we can see that climate change is not an isolated incident. We're already seeing warmer climate. We are already seeing the amount of rain that we've had this year. It's changing. We've already had the hottest year, or to point. We had the hottest year last year, and we've exceeded it on average. So it's very much there. And so when it comes back to this, we have to do it holistically. We all have a carbon budget. Now, the West has used this carbon budget for a large amount of time. So you are then in that kind of limited carbon budget space. But what the UK GBC has done really, really well with their net zero standard is they've taken that carbon budget and then they've divided and partitioned that to the building type and typology, and saying, if you're building a building that is an office building or a commercial residential building, this is your carbon budget, and that's how you're net zero. So you have that regulation. Now, who's going to implement it and who actually has the biggest stake is actually the government and the local authorities, giving them the opportunity to actually manage their neighborhood. Effectively, they've got a portfolio of buildings that they've got to manage. They've got a portfolio of buildings that they can look at, and that's how you start to segment it down. And this is where the City of London is actually doing a phenomenal job with the City of London plan, which comes out for 2040, where they're actually looking at these different elements and they're trying to streamline it. They're working with developers, they're working with their clients to say, how would you go about doing this? So they're not just going blanket, you need to get a 5-star neighbors rating and your energy performance. They're actually saying, can you actually achieve that? They're having the discussions, which has been quite nice to see.
It's been a big consultation.
It has been, and it's been very useful because it's allowed the people to actually come and say, we like the idea of a 5-star neighbors rating, great, because you means that your energy usage is of a reasonable level, our tenants are happy and the rest. However, most of your buildings are heritage buildings and they cannot achieve that, and you need to recognize that. And it's about having that discussion. But the key point then is they can take that away and put that into a framework that works for the quarter mile. And it's working on that principle of you get that stick from the government that goes all the way down and is then implemented.
It's very interesting because we hear a lot about sort of the London plan, and they've done a lot in terms of previously overheating and demands for waste reduction. And now we have the requirement for a circular economy certificate thing. And they've worked with REBA to integrate what they require with the REBA stages, and that's all very seamless. What's your view of what's happening in the rest of the country?
I think if you'd asked me this question last year, I would have said it's not moving fast enough. But what I'm starting to see is local authorities across the country are picking up on these various things. And what I like is they're not picking up on the same issue. So for example, in Bristol, it's all about overheating and future resilience to climate change. It's about future weather files. How does your building comply with it? You go to Manchester, it's slightly different because each one of the cities have their own net zero challenge, and they're drawing on the principles set by the GLA and the rest, but they're setting it to their requirements, which is good because that's what you want. You want the localized, contextualized frameworks coming in. The City of Westminster and the City of London both have been following quite closely with the GLA in terms of what they're implementing. So if you're building in London, you're still building some of the best buildings across. But it's not to say that you're not doing the same thing in Bristol now and the rest, because they're taking those concepts, they're applying it locally, which is good to see.
But that takes you quite interesting into sort of the land of the EU, where their challenge is a lot bigger in terms of they have so many different parts of the EU. They've got Italy, who've got so many heritage buildings, and they've got sort of Scandinavia, who've got a totally different sort of construction. And they've developed their common taxonomy and their sort of their guidelines, but actually how that is administered is going to be very interesting to see how that becomes a sort of a national and a regional thing within that.
It almost feels like it starts to dilute when you get into that sort of situation where you're not able to go into the granular detail that somehow we can do in the UK. We can go into that localized context because a national planning framework allows that. But in the EU, they will struggle with that because also those regions are very different climate-wise as well. So whereas Italy, you'll have very different sort of construction than you would in the Nordic countries. So straight away, that disparity is very difficult to capture, which means you have to water down what you can implement. And you will see that element coming into this. It's about capturing the right stuff and making sure that at least that's followed. So the EU recognizes carbon as one of the key currencies in this conversation, and they are implementing regulations around that, which we are doing the same as well. So it's good to see that at least there's some commonality within the built environment wider group, that carbon seems to be the base element that we look at.
I mean, I think the other thing that's interesting, Mike, you were talking about, what's the driver, at what level is it? But you get firms like Arup, like Waterman, who are actually really embracing that as a challenge and seeing that as a point of difference and pushing pressure on that way. Let's see what we can do. And I think that's an interesting pressure as well.
It's very interesting. I think that market forces are actually becoming a leader of some of these behaviours, some of these approaches. We've sort of skirted around a piece a couple of times, which is around heritage stock and assets. And we talked earlier on about standardised components, and we've talked previously about buildings not being designed to be taken apart historically. What's the approach to bringing a circular model into updating, upgrading, retrofitting? Maybe particularly in the context of southern Italy and northern Sweden are very different places for doing this. How does that affect what we might choose to do?
Well, I think when picking the point on heritage buildings in particular, that's where your building performance side actually gains a lot from your building services, because that's the one thing you can change, because you're very limited in terms of fabric, you're very limited in terms of the structure. Sometimes even very limited in terms of the internal layout, because it depends on what's been listed within the heritage listing. So working within the confines of that, it actually comes down to clever building services engineering that allows you to get that performance out of it, which again, it can be challenging. For example, you'd really sometimes need to hide away your air source heat pumps from public view. You might have space constraints on how it's done, so that there are some real life challenges, but that's where you need your building services engineer to work with you to get that. There's also an element of being able to justify interventions that, where you can present a case to the heritage officer to say certain elements of the building don't really work and are not of heritage value. And when you start to investigate some of the buildings that we have, a lot of them were poorly restored after the war, which when you might think they're 18th century or 17th century, but they're actually 1950s construction and very poor construction. Recently looked at a building on a very prominent building overlooking Regent Park. The entire facade is listed, but you were able to actually argue that when you look at the facade, you can see 7 or 8 different types of bricks. Now, surely they didn't do that. And then they went through archival material and found that there used to be Juliet balconies on that facade, which have disappeared. So apparently the building was repaired about 6 times from the war. It was damaged in the war and it was repaired 6 times. So essentially the heritage value is diminished. However, because that entire area was blanket listed, it got listed as part of it. So the argument had to be made that in order to unlock the potential of the building, yes, demolition is required of certain elements. But then again, that's where structural engineers are getting clever on how they're able to retain. And it's a practice that's gone on in the city for a while now.
In that sort of context, is there scope to use components that have been recovered that are asynchronous with the building, but add benefit or value?
Absolutely. And that's where the designer's creativity comes out, is that being able to reuse that element. And from a commercial point of view, that's a lovely story to tell, to say, and there's a history behind it. A simple plaque that says this fireplace existed in this building eons ago. It was discovered, but now we're showcasing it. It just gives you that passing bit of knowledge in a building. And when you're walking across a building, you're interacting with various elements, and it just becomes one of those elements that you probably remember the building by just saying, oh yeah, I remember that building. It had a very unique fireplace, and there was a story behind it. You've got that opportunity when you're looking at retention and reusing those elements. You can be clever with it.
But some of that is that permitted? Because as soon as, I'm thinking particularly of buildings like churches, which are covered by sort of really very stringent orders to keep things as they are, and the idea of messing with that and putting something new in, even if you know where it comes from, is you need to get people used to that idea. It needs to become acceptable. It needs to become part of the conversation that we have. And I think that's quite a challenge, actually.
And that's where your public consultation element comes in, your pre-planning element. I think developers and the rest will now start to realize that actually your planning process is more like a de-risking process for your entire project, because you're doing all the tangible elements such as measuring carbon, energy performance, and the rest. But it's these software elements of actually saying there's a real social value of that building, and by making an intervention, how is that social value going to be impacted? How is the local neighborhood going to react to that? And that's where consultation processes are getting longer, and they are leading to some interesting challenges.
So do you have a view of how that social value, that how we start to measure the circular economy? I mean, if we're starting to have new ISO standards that are going to measure that, are those going to include social values? Are those going to include environmental values, or are they purely financial?
I think we look at it more in terms of the qualitative and quantitative. So far, I think the standards are bringing in the quantitative quite easily. Yeah. I think they're missing a trick out by not getting the qualitative in there. Social value is a very intrinsic element of the building. Like we interact within the building interacts with the neighborhood. And there have been elements of that showcased as to how it can be deployed in a very useful manner. Amazon, when they did their search for their headquarters location, actually put the headquarters in different neighborhoods to see what impact it would have, and then be able to judge whether that's the right thing to do. Now, you're expecting that sort of moral compass element to come in, but I think it's useful, and it is important that it does, because you don't want to be putting another office building in a primarily residential space, because what's going to happen, and Amazon showed that quite nicely, is the fact that your rental value went up, your cost of living went up 2x, your transportation cost went up a certain amount, your impact on utilities went up. Everything became a lot more expensive just by placing that building there. And I think taking that kind of structured approach actually unlocks a lot more asset value in the long term than it would in the short term.
So what do you think the chances are that something like ISO 5920 is going to bring some of that less quantifiable? Well, actually, we have to find a way of quantifying it.
Yeah.
But it may not be pounds.
No.
Do you think it's going to include elements of that?
Unfortunately, I think we all keep going back to pounds, don't we? As a base currency, carbon or pounds. I mean, the SROI, the social return of investment framework, has been around for a while, and it has been utilized. You've also got other metrics there, but they're not consolidated metrics. And I mean, to be fair, how do you quantify something like social value? Because it is based on a wider neighborhood and their view of that structure and that building itself and the people within the building as well.
Or potentially a group of buildings.
Yes.
The community. This is not necessarily about a single edifice.
Yes, exactly.
There are communities that are built of rows of terraced houses. And there's a community that has a soul and a heart that the residents would tell you was ripped out when arguably better buildings were put in, but actually the essence was lost somewhere along the way.
Absolutely, and it's that element. How do you capture it?
Yeah.
From an asset developer point of view, they're not going to be able to see that. It's only the people living there that can actually express that. and at the same time, the city and the rest will not see it. The planners will not. Planners may see it, but the planners will not. Will also have. They have a development plan in place. They're looking to encourage that development. They've got a role to play in that process. So it's how do they actually capture that within the wider circular economy context is a difficult one.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the other areas that we've touched on a little bit in this is around managing risk as part of all of this, and of course there's risk to communities and to social value and so on. One of the challenges with all of this has to be insurance. Is the insurance market keeping up with where we're going with circular economy and reuse of components and so on?
I think some of them are, but not to the extent where you can say that they've gone mainstream yet.
Right.
I think insurance is still one of the stumbling blocks for it. But what a lot of the larger developers have kind of looked at it and they've weighed the options and they're happy to go without it. So, for example, if a building has been refurbished, you've got raised access flooring, which is in good nick. It's been utilized. The asset owner is basically saying, we know that raised access floor is fine. No one's legs have gone through it. We're happy to live with it in the new building. And it is taking that pragmatic approach. And actually, it is the asset owners that can push that area a bit more and start to mirror up. And you're starting to see that pressure. And it's not like the insurance industry isn't aware of it. They're very much aware of it. They're watching it. They need that kind of stability in that sector to say, yes, we'll warrant it.
And I suppose they might argue they don't yet have enough data.
Yeah.
So any actuary will sit and say, actually, I can't perform the calculation. But again, maybe this is about shifting some of that risk. We no pun intended, but we've come full circle to where we were a while ago with component suppliers who retain the ownership and they rent the lighting or the other fitments or so on. It feels like it's reprofiling the risk of any development project or redevelopment project across the different stakeholders.
I mean, I think yes, there is an element of that, but I think one of the big things is clearly that the construction sector is very much driven by contracts.
Yeah. And
contracts are there to offset risk. And that's something that I don't think anybody's looked at. I mean, you can have a sort of an informal, well, I'll underwrite the strike, that's going to be strong enough, it's going to be good enough. But when you're starting to talk about these myriad of contracts, particularly when you start to look at how work is parcelled out of the work packages.
So what needs to happen there? Is it root and branch change, or is it a different sort of conversation in the project?
I think these things tend to work at both levels, working together. I think there need to be some sort of higher level discussions about different ways things might be done. But I think, as Ankit has found, you'll also find some smaller individual type projects where this happens, and people then realise that, oh, they're doing that, so maybe we can do that. And it is that mimicry also that is going to make it all change.
The thing is also people, it's the powers that can influence realizing that asset value can be measured in different ways. Mm-hmm. And it's realizing that, exactly like Pippa said, it's at the moment what's happening is we're getting a massive push towards, getting every sustainability credential in the market, primarily just because it's giving you that green premium on rental value and yield and the rest. So I think it's trying to realize that asset value itself can be looked at in a different way and realized in a different way, which will start to lead that discussion a bit more. Because at the moment, it is still very commercially focused. It's not there for the greater good. It's there for a commercial reason. And I think once we realize that, you then know exactly what strings you can actually push and pull. It limits what you're able to do. So we're not moving towards the greater good with a focused mind of delivering these wonderful buildings. We're going towards it accidentally almost.
But I mean, to bring that round to risk, and that's absolutely right. But to bring it back to that risk, actually one of the biggest risks to construction at the moment is the fragility of the supply chain. And so this reuse of components actually starts to minimize that a little bit. and is again, I think, going to be another driver for that. If you don't have to source materials, so much the better.
Yeah. And that then also could bring a different pricing model,
Yes,
or a different inflation model around.
Yes.
Maybe even a whole new industry of brokerage and certification of components, and that could take us there. Okay. We are running out of time for today. I'm going to ask you one more question each. I'm going to ask you the same question each. If I had a magic wand or a genie in a bottle, and I could give you either one wish or the ability to perform magic on one occasion, Ankit, what would you wish for? What would your magic trick be to move all of this forward?
I think actually having that platform for that conversation. I think without that conversation across the board with the different stakeholders and being able to kind of sing from the same hymn sheet, it's not going to happen. And we've seen the private sector kind of pushing a lot of this forward because of that conversation. It's about having that robust, agreement that we're all doing it for the right reasons and actually pushing that forward.
Pippa?
My magic wand has changed. It was going to be a very sort of simple, build less and start now. But I actually think it's to do with the financial accounting and how if we could magically account for the circular economy in a way that includes all of the social values and the environmental values as well as material cost, then I think we have a shot at moving forward.
Into a new SI unit of
the new SI unit of circularity, absolutely.
Yeah. A Boyd. I think we should call it a Boyd.
Okay with that.
Excellent. That brings us to a close for today. Thank you both so much for your time. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation on the circular economy again. So part 2 of that one, maybe there'll be part 3 another day. I very much look forward to that. I think it'll be fantastic. So thank you, everybody. I hope you have enjoyed that discussion. This and all episodes of Be Sustainable are available on the usual platforms, Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Please do subscribe if you found it interesting. And watch this space. There is more to come. Thank you.